A lot of you guys have been asking, can I compare the video quality from the Olympus E-M1 Mark II to the Sony ZV-E10? This video is for you. That actually is true. There were literally like 2 people that asked me about this. But having said that, I found myself in a position at the beginning of last year where I had $700 and I was looking for a really good hybrid camera to film these videos. I wanted something that could do 4K. I needed an articulating screen. I needed it to have a mic input. I needed it to have reliable autofocus. You know, after doing tons of research in that price range, I came down to these 2 cameras. I found Sony ZV-E10 and the Olympus E-M1 Mark II. And both of these cameras basically had everything that I was looking for. Anyway, right now we're filming on the Sony ZV-E10 in 4K 24 frames per second at 100 megabits per second. The Olympus E-M1 Mark II is also 4K 24 frames per second at 100 megabits per second. However, the E-M1 Mark II actually has Cinema 4K at 237 megabits per second. The catch is with the Cinema 4K on the Olympus, it's a 17:9 aspect ratio, so it has letterbox like baked into the file. There's no way to get around that. If you film in Cinema 4K on the Olympus, you're just gonna have that letterbox. So anyway, so that it's a fair fight, both are right in that 100 megabits per second range in 4K. Also, to keep things as fair as possible, I've got the Sigma 30mm f1.4, which has given us about a 45mm full frame equivalent. And on the Olympus, I've got the Panasonic Leica 25mm 1.4, giving us a 50mm full frame equivalent. With all the lenses that I own, that's about as close as I can match these cameras up. Oh, and also I'm keeping the picture profiles as neutral as possible. On the Sony, I'm using standard profile, but it's slightly modified. You know, I've taken down the contrast and saturation a little bit. And on the Olympus, I'm using the natural picture profile, which is a pretty neutral profile to begin with. The Olympus does actually have a log profile, but I filmed with that profile for about 6 months and I never really liked any of my footage that I got out of that. And when I watched a bunch of YouTube videos of other people filming in Olympus's log profile, I didn't really like the way that their footage looked either. I don't mean that in a mean way, it's just I wasn't crazy about how that footage looks once it's color graded. I'm sure there's people out there who do amazing log footage with the Olympus, but I haven't been happy with what I've seen so far. Now, in terms of build quality with these 2 cameras, they are worlds apart. Sony ZV-E10 is a very plasticky, lightweight camera. It's pretty entry-level feeling. It's not particularly robust, and it certainly isn't weather sealed. Whereas with the Olympus actually feels like a professional camera. It's a sturdy magnesium alloy. It has really good ergonomics. I mean, I would say out of all the cameras that I own, the Olympus is one of my favorites, just the way it feels in the hands. Like, it just feels so solid. But in terms of actual usability, obviously the ZV-E10 is perfectly fine. It's just not gonna win any awards in build quality. Now, as far as autofocus goes, the Sony ZV-E10 probably wins, but the Olympus is actually really, really good. Like, it didn't start out good. I mean, they had to actually give it a firmware update, but once they got that firmware update, the Olympus is pretty on par with any Sony or Canon camera out there. So you do notice that where the Sony is obviously faster, but the Olympus is actually really solid. And in terms of like the product showcase type stuff, Sony obviously has product showcase, and with the Olympus, you do still have to kind of block your face because it's very good at tracking a human subject. Now, in terms of lens selection, the Olympus, I still feel is kind of more limited than what the Sony is. Like with the Sony, you've got these 1.4 lenses and you do get a pretty shallow depth of field. On the Olympus, you are getting a shallow depth of field, but it's still like a 2.8 full frame equivalent. With Micro Four Thirds, you know, you do have those 1.2 lenses, but those lenses are so expensive, whereas on here, these 1.4 lenses are pretty cheap. You know, Sigma, Viltrox make a ton of really good lenses for Sony, and all of those are pretty affordable. On the Olympus, there's a frustrating amount of like 1.8 lenses or just really, really expensive 1.2 lenses. And shallow depth of field aside, I am one of those people where I see depth in an image and I don't quite see as much depth in Micro Four Thirds. Now, I think a lot of times people confuse like blurry background with depth, and blurry background is not at all what I'm talking about. What I mean is bigger sensors just have a more three-dimensional look to them. Like a full frame camera, even when it's stopped down to f4, you just kind of see this like spatial relation. Like it just feels more of a deep image. Whereas Micro Four Thirds, being such a small sensor, you don't quite see that kind of depth in the scene. Having said that, if all you care about is bokeh and like shallow depth of field, obviously Micro Four Thirds is completely capable of producing all kinds of bokeh. The funny thing is, when I get asked which one of these is like the better choice, the fact of the matter is they're both actually really good options. Sane, sensible people like you guys watching this are probably just trying to buy one camera. You're probably not a camera collector like me with a ridiculous collection, so you probably aren't going to buy both of them. So having said that, you know, the first big difference between these two cameras is just purely cosmetic and physical. The Olympus is obviously a much, much better body than what the Sony ZV-E10 has. So if you're super concerned with like, you know, sturdiness and weather sealing and magnesium alloy and all that, you might not be into the Sony ZV-E10. And plus, if you're into photography too, the ZV-E10 doesn't even have a viewfinder. You know, so the Olympus actually has just an electronic viewfinder and it works great. But if all you care about is making like content creation or these types of YouTube videos, both cameras really do have everything that you need. They've got that articulating screen, they film in 4K, they have reliable autofocus, they have pretty good low light performance, they have a mic input, and they each have their own version of stabilization. But having said that, the Olympus obviously wins on stabilization, but the ZV-E10 actually does a pretty good job with its electronic stabilization. Now, in terms of image stabilization, the Sony ZV-E10 doesn't have IBIS, but it has electronic image stabilization and it actually works pretty well. The only catch with the ZV-E10 is its processor is kind of slow, and so its read speed of all those lines causes a ton of rolling shutter. You know, if you're filming any kind of panning shot on the ZV-E10, you're just going to see this kind of crazy warpiness, whereas the Olympus actually has a pretty fast processor and you're not going to see that kind of rolling shutter. But yeah, in terms of stabilization, the Olympus has some of the best stabilization that I've ever used. As far as slow motion goes, the Sony ZV-E10 kind of wins there. The ZV-E10, you've got 1080p up to 120 frames per second, whereas on the Olympus, all you have is 1080p at 60 frames per second. And both of these cameras top out at 4K 30 frames per second. So yeah, to get into the subtle nuances of which one of these should you actually buy, if the body type and the build quality is very important to you, then I would lean towards the Olympus. You know, the Olympus just wins hands down. You know, if you're a photographer and you need a viewfinder. Well, the Olympus wins that because the ZV-E10 doesn't even have a viewfinder. But if all that you care about is just having a good hybrid camera that you can film YouTube videos with, do some sort of content creation, and also take pictures, both of these cameras actually have everything that you need. Anyway, I think that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.